The torpedo approach trainer at the 3rd U-boat training division in Neustadt looked like the conning tower of a submarine without the submarine underneath it. A trainee commander climbed into it, pressed his eye to the periscope, and saw a simulated battle picture with target bearing, target speed, and target distance. He fed the numbers to the torpedo computer, turned the wheel, and fired a dummy control. The exercise stopped, and an instructor showed him what he had gotten wrong. It was the most advanced training simulator Germany had built for submarine warfare. By 1944, new commanders were spending 3 months in the classroom, and then 4 weeks in this device, before being certified, ready for sea. In 1941, their predecessors had spent a full year in preparation before their first patrol. Germany was not getting more confident in its training program. It was getting more desperate. In the years before the war, Admiral Karl Dönitz built a U-boat training system from nothing. He had almost no boats, almost no budget, and a navy that hadn't fought a submarine war in 20 years. What he had was a clear idea of what he needed, and the administrative energy to build it. The pre-war training cycle was deliberate. A new officer candidate joined the Navy and spent roughly 18 months in general naval training before ever being assigned to a submarine. Then came submarine school, and then time aboard training boats in the Baltic, and then tactical exercises, and then torpedo firing practice, and then time as a junior watch officer on an operational boat before being considered for a command of his own. The full pipeline from civilian to combat-ready submarine commander took years. The men who came out of that system were thoroughly prepared. Günther Prien had trained through that program. So had Joachim Schepke and Otto Kretschmer. The three of them, along with a cohort of equally well-prepared commanders, made the U-boat arm the most effective naval strike force Germany had in the early war years. Between June 1940 and the end of 1941, Kretschmer alone sank 44 ships. Prien sank 31 before he went down in March 1941. Schepke sank 39 before he was killed the same month. These three commanders represented the peak of what the training system could produce when it was given time to work properly, and the Atlantic was not yet defended effectively. The problem with a war is that wars consume the men it takes years to build. By 1942, Dönitz had lost most of his experienced commanders and was filling the frontline boats with men who had gone through a compressed version of the original training. The compression was not a deliberate choice. It was a calculation forced on him by arithmetic. He needed more crews than the full training cycle could produce, and he needed them now. May 1943 changed everything. 43 U-boats lost in 31 days, not all in one battle, spread across the Atlantic from the convoy lanes to the Bay of Biscay, one after another, each crew going under with months or years of invested training. When Dönitz withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic on May 24, 1943, he described the situation in his war diary as one where the enemy holds every trump card. What the casualty figures didn't capture was the secondary loss. Experienced junior officers were the training system's most valuable output. A commander who had survived 6 patrols had learned things that no simulator could teach. He had learned how to interpret water sounds, how to judge the geometry of an attacking destroyer, how the boat behaved at different depths under different conditions, how to keep a crew functional under sustained attack. That knowledge was transferable. Experienced first watch officers became future commanders. When those men died, the knowledge died with them. The U-boat.net training records describe the result directly. The losses from 1943 onward eventually rendered parts of the training course ineffective, because the experienced men needed to run the advanced portions of the course were no longer available in sufficient numbers. The instructors at the tactical training schools were drawing on a shrinking pool of veterans. New classes were coming through faster than old hands could absorb. There was a specific category of loss that the casualty numbers didn't capture well. The first watch officers. A first watch officer was the number 2 man aboard a U-boat. typically a lieutenant, with enough patrols to be competent, but not yet enough to have his own command. These men were the training pipeline's main output. Train them long enough, give them enough patrols as a second, and they became the next generation of commanders. Lose them, and the next generation of commanders didn't exist. In May 1943, Germany lost first watch officers by the boatload, in boats that carried 45 to 50 men and left no survivors. The training system had to start that cohort over from nothing. By the end of 1943, Germany was commissioning new submarines at a rate that outpaced the production of crews capable of handling them. The boats were ready before the men inside them were, and the solution that Dönitz was forced to accept was to send those men to sea anyway and see what happened. What happened was documented, patrol by patrol, in the operational records. New crews made mistakes that experienced crews didn't. They surfaced too early after an attack. They misidentified sonar contacts. They had not developed the instinct for when something was wrong with the boat before the instruments confirmed it. The instincts that kept experienced men alive required time at sea to build. And the time at sea that built instincts was also, in 1944, the time at sea that killed you before those instincts had a chance to form. You needed to survive to get better. Getting better was the only way to survive. The circle had no entrance point that didn't require something the training program no longer had time to provide. That was the problem, with a war that consumed faster than it could be replenished. The Baltic Sea was where Germany trained its submarine crews throughout the war. The bay areas around Danzig, Gotenhafen, Pillau, and Memel were the practice waters. Training boats operating in those areas ran diving exercises, weapons drills, and simulated attack approaches with the trainee commanders. The Baltic was supposed to be safe. There were no Allied submarines operating there, and almost no Allied aircraft to speak of, especially early in the war. A closed sea where new crews could make mistakes and learn from them without getting killed. This was the point of the Baltic training grounds. From 1942 onward, Soviet submarines began operating in the Baltic. Not in great numbers, and not always effectively, but enough to make the training area less safe than it had been. By 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed toward Germany, and Soviet forces took ports along the southern Baltic coast, the training grounds were directly threatened. Facilities at Memel, Pillau, and Danzig were eventually overrun or evacuated under fire. The 4th U-boat Training Division had been established in Memel in February 1944, specifically to train the technical crews for the new Type 21 boats. It was disbanded and evacuated when Soviet forces reached the area. The 24th U-boat Flotilla, which ran the commander shooting training course at Memel, the 4-week course that certified new commanders in attack techniques, was disbanded in March 1945, weeks before the German surrender. The training infrastructure that Germany had built in the Baltic over 4 years was dismantled in months by a front line that had collapsed. New commanders were being certified in techniques they would never have time to practice, on boats that would be scuttled before they reached the ocean, in a war that the training program was now operating entirely in the service of institutional habit rather than any realistic hope of changing the outcome. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff had been one of the first purpose-built cruise liners for Hitler's Strength Through Joy leisure program. It launched in 1937, sailed 50 cruises, carrying 65,000 workers on subsidized holidays, and was taken over by the Navy when the war began. From November 1940, it sat at anchor in Gotenhafen Harbour in occupied Poland and served as a floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division. The trainees lived aboard. They were drilled, tested, instructed, and rotated through the training exercises that would eventually certify them for operational boats. The ship's swimming pool, the restaurants, the entertainment spaces that had been designed to project the prosperity of the Nazi state to factory workers on holiday, all of it became part of the training infrastructure for submarine warfare. The Gustloff was part of the reason Gotenhafen had become the center of Baltic U-boat training. The facilities were there. The anchorage was protected. The men were housed and fed aboard ships rather than in shoreside barracks, which was considered more appropriate for training sailors. Over 4 years, thousands of men rotated through those accommodations on their way to operational U-boats. By January 1945, the training program at Gotenhafen was finishing. Not because it had been officially wound down, but because the war had come to the door. The Soviet winter offensive had broken through in East Prussia and was advancing toward the Baltic coast. The training grounds at Pillau were already under threat. The men aboard the ships in Gotenhafen harbor were not just trainees anymore. They were also refugees, in the same position as the 2 million German civilians converging on the Baltic ports in the January cold. Dönitz ordered Operation Hannibal on January 21st, 1945. Every ship that could float would be used to evacuate as many people as possible from the ports of East Prussia to safety in the west. The Gustloff was pressed into service as a transport. The Gustloff had been designed to carry roughly 1,900 people. The ship's departure manifest on January 30th listed 6,050 people, including 173 crew, 918 naval personnel, 373 members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary, 162 wounded soldiers, and 4,424 refugees, a large number of them children. The actual number aboard was almost certainly higher, as many people boarded without being recorded in the chaos of the embarkation. Most estimates of the final passenger count range from 8,000 to 10,000. The ship built for 1,900 people. The captain, Friedrich Pettersson, faced a command dispute over the route. 3 other officers were aboard with equal or higher authority over different aspects of the ship's operation. There was an argument over whether to sail close to the coast, where the risk of mines was higher, or further out, where the risk of submarines was higher. A message arrived reporting a minesweeper convoy operating near the coast. Captain Peterson decided to sail further out and turned on the ship's navigation lights to avoid a collision with the minesweepers. The navigation lights made the Wilhelm Gustloff visible for miles in the dark water. The Soviet submarine S-13 was captained by Alexander Marinesko, who was in a difficult position with his own chain of command following an unauthorized absence from his boat on New Year's Eve. He needed a significant success to protect his career. When he spotted the large illuminated ship leaving Gotenhafen that evening, he shadowed it for 2 hours before making his attack. At 9:16 in the evening, 3 torpedoes struck the Wilhelm Gustloff on her port side. The first hit the bow, locking watertight doors before off-duty crew sleeping in those sections could escape. The second hit near the swimming pool, where the 373 Women's Naval Auxiliary members had taken shelter. Most of them died immediately. The third hit the engine room, cutting power throughout the ship. The sea temperature in the Baltic in January was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. In that water, an unprotected person loses the ability to swim within minutes and loses consciousness within an hour. The Gustloff sank in about 60 minutes. The lifeboats that existed were frozen in their davits and could not be launched in the panic. Many passengers had removed their life jackets below decks because the overcrowding and broken ventilation had made the lower decks intolerably hot. Rescue ships pulled 1,252 people from the water. German archives researcher Heinz Schoen, who survived the sinking and spent decades interviewing other survivors and reviewing the records, concluded that approximately 9,343 people died. That number is larger than all the lives lost in the sinkings of the Titanic and the Lusitania combined. It is the largest confirmed loss of life from a single ship sinking in recorded maritime history. It has remained so since the evening of January 30th, 1945. February 10, 1945. The German liner General von Steuben was sailing from Pillau, the port directly east of Danzig, heading west towards Swinemünde with approximately 4,000 people aboard. The manifest listed 2,800 wounded soldiers, 800 civilian refugees, and 270 Navy medical personnel. Like the Gustloff before it, the actual number was likely higher than the official count. The Soviet submarine S-13 was still on patrol. Captain Marinesco found the General von Steuben. He fired 2 torpedoes. Both hit, and the ship sank in about 20 minutes. Approximately 300 people were pulled from the water by the torpedo boat T-196 and brought to the port of Kolberg. The remaining 3,500 to 3,700 people who had been aboard the General von Steuben died in the cold water. Marinesco had now sunk 2 ships in 11 days, killing an estimated 12,800 people between them. These numbers are not entirely certain. The boarding records in Operation Hannibal were incomplete from the start. People were climbing aboard ships in conditions where record-keeping was not the immediate priority. But the scale is not in serious dispute. For his actions during this patrol, Marinesco was recommended for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. His superiors did not approve the recommendation. His unauthorized absence and his habit of criticizing Soviet tactics and equipment in writing had permanently damaged his standing. He was eventually dismissed from the Navy and later sentenced to 3 years in a Siberian labor camp on unrelated charges. He was posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union designation in 1990. Imagine you are 18 years old and you arrived at Gottenhafen for submarine training in September 1944. You have been in the Navy for 4 months. You are going to spend the next several months living on a ship in the harbor, learning the fundamentals of submarine operation, before being assigned to a training flotilla for the tactical phase of your preparation. The ship you live on is the Wilhelm Gustloff. You are not a frontline soldier. You have not been to sea in combat. You are a trainee, somewhere in the middle of a months-long process designed to make you capable enough to operate in an environment that kills more than 3 out of every 4 men who enter it. The training is the thing that is supposed to improve those odds, if anything can. You celebrate Christmas aboard the Gustloff. The harbor is crowded. There are rumors about the Eastern Front. The instructors continue the course. You continue attending your sessions in torpedo calculation, in damage control procedures, in the flooding equalization technique you'll need if the boat ever has to be abandoned. The training continues because stopping it would mean acknowledging something that isn't acknowledged yet. In January, the harbor fills with civilians. You can see them from the deck, the people walking toward the water from the roads inland, carrying what they can carry. The training continues. Then the orders come. The ship you have lived on for months is going to be used as a transport. You are going to get on it, along with thousands of other people, and sail west away from the advancing front. It is January 30th, 1945. The sea temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. April 16th, 1945. The war in Europe had 3 weeks left. The MV Goya was a Norwegian-built freighter that Germany had seized after the occupation of Norway and pressed into service as a troop transport. The ship was designed to carry 850 people. On the night of April 16th, it was loaded with approximately 6,100 documented passengers, with the actual number likely higher. The passengers included German soldiers, wounded men from the Eastern Front, and civilians who had waited too long to evacuate and were now taking whatever space remained. They were sailing from the Hel Peninsula westward across the Baltic, part of the continuing Operation Hannibal evacuation. The convoy moved at reduced speed because one of the accompanying vessels had engine problems and needed to stop for repairs. Soviet submarine L-3, captained by Vladimir Konovalov, found the convoy in the dark. At 4 minutes before midnight, Konovalov ordered a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 hit the Goya, 1 struck amidships, the second in the stern. The explosions were large enough to knock the ship's mast down onto the people sleeping on the top deck. The Goya broke in two and sank in under 4 minutes. The water was 4 degrees. The ship's passengers had not been equipped with adequate life-saving gear because the Goya was a cargo vessel converted to a transport, not a ship designed to carry passengers at all. In the darkness and the cold, with thousands of people in the water and a sinking ship pulling a column of air down as it went under, the convoy escorts could find only 183 survivors. The death toll is estimated between 6,000 and 7,000. It may be the second largest single ship loss of life in maritime history, exceeded only by the Wilhelm Gustloff. The wreck of the Goya lies at 76 meters in the Baltic Sea, roughly 30 miles off the coast of Poland. It was located in April 2003, exactly 58 years after the sinking, by an international diving expedition. The wreck is covered in fishing nets from the decades when its location was known only to local fishermen. It has been declared a war grave by the Polish Maritime Office. Diving within 500 meters of it is prohibited. The wreck is littered with human remains. The most telling statistic from the late war U-boat campaign isn't the total losses, it's the distribution of those losses by patrol experience. In the early years of the war, a U-boat commander's first few patrols were genuinely dangerous, but survivable. The learning curve was steep, but the Atlantic was not yet defended in ways that punished inexperience immediately and absolutely. Experienced men could teach newer men, and the newer men had time to absorb the lessons. Some of the best commanders of the early war had been nervous and uncertain on their first patrols and had found their way to competence by the second or third. By 1944, the Atlantic had changed in ways that removed that margin. The Allied anti-submarine forces could detect, classify, and attack a submarine within hours of its entering their patrol zones. A crew that hadn't developed the instincts for silent running, for managing battery, trim, under sustained depth charge attack, for knowing when sonar contact from an escort meant immediate danger versus the kind that could still be waited out. Those crews didn't last long enough to develop those instincts. The U-boat.net records document this pattern directly. Of the U-boats lost in 1944 and 45, a significant portion were lost on their first or second operational patrols. Some never completed a single patrol. Some were sunk within days of leaving their ports. The pattern was consistent enough that Allied intelligence analysts noted it. New boats could often be identified from their behavior before visual confirmation. They surfaced too early. They held sonar contact positions that experienced commanders wouldn't hold. They made radio transmissions at predictable intervals that gave direction-finding stations easy bearings. The training program had been designed to address exactly these problems. The 4-week commander shooting course at the 24th Flotilla, the simulated battle pictures through the periscope, the torpedo approach training at the 3rd U-boat Training Division. All of this existed specifically to give new commanders the pattern recognition they needed before their first encounter with a real escort. And the program had worked well when it had time to work. The problem in 1944 was that the course had been compressed. The instructors were fewer, the practice opportunities were fewer, and the men coming through were younger. A commander who completed the full training pipeline in 1941 had spent several months as a watch officer on an operational boat before being given his own command. He had been in the Atlantic. He had seen what a depth charge attack felt like from inside a steel tube, how the boat moved, what the sounds meant. He brought that experience back to the training facilities, and then, when he was ready, took command and applied it. A commander certified in late 1944 had gone through a compressed version of the same course and had then been assigned directly to a new boat with a crew that was also compressed through training. Neither the commander nor his crew had been in the Atlantic. They were going together for the first time. The learning that was supposed to happen before the first patrol was going to happen during the first patrol. in waters where the difference between learning and dying was measured in minutes. Herbert Werner's first encounter with the reality of submarine service came before he ever reached the Atlantic. Werner had been assigned as first watch officer to U-612 in April 1942, operating in the Baltic under Paul Siegmann. The Baltic was training water. It was where you learned the boat. It was where accidents happened that were supposed to be survivable because the depths were shallow enough and the water was close enough to shore that people could be rescued. In August 1942, U-612 sank in the Baltic as a result of a collision. Werner and much of the crew survived. They were transferred to another boat, U-230, and Werner eventually became first lieutenant there. What the Baltic loss represented was not an unusual event by that point in the war. Submarines were being lost in the training areas regularly. A boat running practice dives, a crew still learning the handling characteristics, a mistake in the flooding sequence, or a navigation error in unfamiliar shallow water, and the boat was on the bottom. The Baltic was supposed to be the safe place to make those mistakes, but the Baltic was not forgiving if the mistakes were serious enough. By 1943, training accidents in the Baltic were a recognized problem with a recognized cause. Too many new boats, too many inexperienced crews, not enough experienced men to supervise them all. The 2nd U-boat Training Division was operating at a pace that made careful oversight of every training dive impossible. Instructors were spread across too many boats. Boats were going out on unsupervised dives before the crew had fully absorbed what they needed to know. Werner survived his Baltic accident and went on to a long operational career. Most of the men who had accidents in the Baltic in 1943 and 1944 were not as fortunate. Shallow water doesn't mean survivable. A submarine that goes to the bottom in a training accident in 25 meters of the Baltic is still a submarine on the bottom, and the men inside it face the same flooding procedure, the same chlorine gas risk, the same problem of opening a hatch against sea pressure that they would face in the Atlantic. The training wasn't supposed to kill them, but it did, regularly, in the closing years of the war. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany commissioned 1,181 U-boats. 785 were lost. Of the 40,000, 900 men who served in the U-boat arm, approximately 28,000 died. 3 out of 4. Those aggregate numbers cover the entire war, from the happy time of 1940 and 41, when the Atlantic was almost undefended, through the middle period when the battle was contested, to the final years when Dönitz was sending crews to sea in full knowledge that most of them weren't coming back. The distribution within those numbers is what tells the training or story. In 1940 and 1941, the casualty rate among operational U-boats was roughly 15 to 20%. The patrols were dangerous and men died, but the boats that went out had a reasonable chance of completing the patrol and returning. Commanders who survived their first 2 or 3 patrols acquired the experience that made them significantly harder to kill on subsequent patrols. The longer you survived, the better your odds, to a point. By 1944, the casualty rate had risen to the point where, statistically, a new crew going on a first patrol in the North Atlantic had a better than even chance of not returning. The calculation that had made submarine service a high-risk but sustainable career choice in 1940 had become a calculation that made it nearly certain death in 1944. Sending a compressed training crew into that environment was not a military decision in any meaningful sense. It was a bureaucratic decision. The boats were built. The orders said fill them with crews. The crews had gone through the available training, and therefore the boats went to sea. Werner wrote in his memoir that he felt it was his duty to set the record straight for his fallen comrades. Of the cadets who had trained with him, of the friends whose boats sent final radio messages over the years and then were never heard from again, almost none survived. Not because they were poorly trained in the early years, but because the war consumed the trained men faster than the training could produce them, and the solution Germany arrived at was to reduce the standard rather than reduce the pace. That solution kept the boats going to sea. It did not keep the crews inside them alive. The most documented aspect of the late war U-boat campaign is that Dönitz knew the losses were unsustainable and continued anyway. The war diary entries are available. The correspondence with the German Naval High Command is preserved. There was no illusion among the senior leadership about what was happening. Dönitz's position was not that the patrols were going to succeed in any meaningful tactical sense by 1944. His position was that stopping them was strategically worse. Allied anti-submarine forces that weren't hunting U-boats would be deployed to other theaters. The perception that Germany had given up the Atlantic entirely would affect neutral opinion and give Allied planners freedom to stop allocating resources to convoy protection. A live submarine, even one that accomplished nothing, tied up Allied resources. A dead submarine had tied up resources until it died. This argument made a certain bureaucratic sense and a complete moral nonsense. The men being sent to sea in compressed training crews in 1944 and 45 were not being sent because there was a reasonable hope they would survive and contribute to the war effort. They were being sent because the institutional structure of the U-boat arm required boats to go to sea, and the boats that were available had crews, and the crews had gone through the training that was available, and therefore the boats went. Werner described the commanders receiving their orders for late war patrols as knowing the mathematics. 7 boats sent, 1 returned. 8 sent, none returned. The statistics weren't hidden from the commanders. They arrived at their briefings knowing what the numbers said, accepted the orders, and went to sea in boats they knew were likely to be the last place they ever lived. Some commanders refused or found ways to delay or abort. Werner himself describes patrols that were terminated early for reasons that the record accepted without close examination. At the end of a war that was already lost, nobody at U-boat headquarters was scrutinizing aborted patrols too carefully. But most went. Most followed orders that led where the orders led. And the men who died on those patrols were younger and less experienced than the men who had died in 1941, because the men of 1941 had already used up the places they occupied in the casualty records. By January to 1945, the 2nd U-boat Training Division's operations at Gotenhafen were functionally over, even if the paperwork had not yet said so. The Soviet winter offensive, which began January 12th, had broken through German lines in East Prussia with overwhelming force. Within days, the front, which had held through most of 1944, had completely collapsed. Soviet armored columns were advancing toward the Baltic coast at speeds that German command had not prepared for. The German civilian population of East Prussia, millions of people, began moving toward the coast. The ports of Pillau, Gotenhafen, and Danzig were the only exits. The training boats that had been running practice dives in the bay were still there. The instructors were still there. The trainees were still in their courses, some of them aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. The 24th Flotilla's shooting course was still being conducted at Memel, 60 miles to the northeast, where the Soviets would arrive within weeks. The institutional machinery of the training system had no mechanism for stopping itself. It had been built to produce submarine crews, and it continued producing them, in the same facilities, on the same schedule, while the war arrived at its location. Orders were being written, trainees were being evaluated, certifications were being issued, right up until the moment when the buildings needed to be evacuated. Some of those certified trainees boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th. Some had already been assigned to operational boats. Some were waiting for their assignments when the evacuation order came and boarded whatever transport was leaving. The 918 naval personnel listed on the Gustloff's manifest on January 30th included many men who had been completing various phases of submarine training at Gotenhafen and whose training was now definitively complete, in the sense that there was no more training to do and no time to do it in. Dönitz had built the training system at Gotenhafen, specifically to feed the U-boat arm. He was also the admiral who ordered Operation Hannibal, the evacuation that put the training ships into service as transports. He had built the institution that trained the men who were aboard the ship that Marinesco sank. That is not an accusation of specific culpability. It is simply the shape of what happened. The training program ended where it had been operating, in the same harbors, in the same cold water, in the closing weeks of a war that had consumed everything it had been built to support. Herbert Werner served on 5 submarines from 1941 to 1945 and survived. He was one of fewer than 24 U-boat commanders who fought through most of the war and came home. He wrote about the experience in a memoir called Iron Coffins, published in 1969. In the introduction, he wrote that his crews had sailed out obediently, even optimistically, on ludicrous missions that ended in death. He described the ocean floor at war's end as littered with the wreckage of the U-boat campaign. When Werner took command of U-953 in August 1944, he inherited an inexperienced crew in a boat he described as dilapidated. He survived the war with them, making 3 patrols and spending 94 days at sea. One account notes that at one point, Werner stopped reporting into U-boat headquarters at the required intervals. Normally this was a serious violation. At this stage of the war, his command staff quietly overlooked it. 1 patrol group sent out 7 boats and 1 returned. The fact that Werner's boat returned was, in that context, a cause for relief rather than reprimand. Werner was born in May 1920 in Freiburg. He joined the Navy at 19 as an officer candidate. He first went to sea on a submarine in April 1941, when the battle was still contested, or when it at least looked that way from inside it. His early patrols were on U-557, then as first watch officer on U-612, which sank in the Baltic in a collision in August 1942. He survived and transferred to U-230. He eventually took command of U-415 in April 1944, made 2 abortive patrols, and lost that boat to a mine in Brest Harbor in July. He then received U-953. By the time he came home, almost every man he had trained beside was dead. He moved to the United States in 1957 and became an American citizen. He lived to be 92 years old, dying in Florida in April 2013. The men aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th, 1945, did not get to be 92. The men in the training pipeline who had not yet shipped out, who boarded the Gustloff as one of the 918 naval personnel and did not get off, did not get to write memoirs about their compressed training and their inexperienced boats and the orders that came anyway. This is what the training program's collapse looked like in the operational records. Not one dramatic failure, but a long arithmetic. 7 boats were sent out, and 1 returned. 4 weeks later, 7 more. Send enough of them, and eventually you get 1 back, and call that a success, because the alternative is acknowledging what the numbers actually say. The numbers had been saying the same thing since May 1943. The program compressed, the men got younger, the preparation got shorter, and the patrols continued. Germany spent 4 years building the most sophisticated submarine training system in the world. The periscope simulators, the torpedo approach trainers, the specialized flotillas for sonar, for tactical attack, for engineering, the facilities at Gotenhafen and Memel and Danzig and Pillau, the thousands of training officers, the doctrines, the manuals, the courses, and the certifications. All of it was designed to do one thing: produce commanders and crews capable of surviving long enough to be worth the investment. By 1944, Germany was producing them in 3 months. By early 1945, the buildings where they trained were being evacuated ahead of the Soviet advance. The training ships were being pressed into refugee service. And the men who were supposed to complete their courses were sailing into a Baltic Sea that had become the operational theatre for the Soviet submarines now hunting the convoys the training ships were riding. The training program was still running when it ended. Not because anyone believed it was working, because the alternative to running it was nothing, and nothing was unacceptable to people who had to write the orders. The men who ran the program were not villains. They were officers following doctrine in an institution that had been built to run, and that kept running because institutions do. The men who attended the shortened courses were not fools. They were conscripts doing their required time in a service that had been consuming men since 1940, and the men who gave the orders for the late war patrols understood the mathematics and gave the orders anyway, because the mathematics had not yet officially produced a conclusion that orders could acknowledge. Herbert Werner called them iron coffins. The ocean floor was littered with them by May 1945, along with 28,000 men who had trained in whatever system was available at whatever time they came through it. That's the thing about a training program. It only works until the war starts consuming the men faster than the program can make them ready.